Hello there, Anjali. I'm
Hi.
Travis.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Welcome to Issue 35.
Thank you.
Have you been to many issues before?
I have.
How many?
I think 6.
Nice. And what brought you here this year to Issue 35?
Well, I haven't been to any conference since before COVID.
Okay.
It took me a couple years to be ready to travel again.
Okay, well, welcome back.
Thank you. So I think the last one I went to was the 27th,
Okay.
whichever, yeah. But I also presented. I presented yesterday.
Okay.
So I had submitted an interesting case that I was involved with, and it was accepted. So I was excited to share that with the community.
So this interesting case, where do you work? Where's your?
I'm self-employed. So I was one of the old guard at Cellmark from
Okay.
the Maryland laboratory.
Okay.
I worked as an analyst at Cellmark in the 90s. And then I decided to go back to law school. So I'm also an attorney, and I worked at NIJ for several years administering DNA lab grants and creating educational conferences for attorneys and scientists. And now I do defense consulting and teach at Arizona State.
Oh, that's a phenomenal pathway. I love it.
Thank you.
So what was this interesting case? Since I didn't get to see your presentation,
Aw.
give me the cliff notes.
Okay, so I lived in South Dakota for 8 years.
Okay.
And during COVID, I relocated to Arizona. But this case began when I was still in South Dakota. I worked on it as a defense expert for about 4.5 years. The trial was
Okay.
long. It was a longer
delayed.
time, right? Because courts were closed for about a year.
Yeah.
But the title of my talk was Decapitation in the Dakotas. And
Sounds interesting.
yeah, it was. I made it. The victim in the case was decapitated, but I thought it was a catchy title.
Yes.
But as I said in my talk yesterday, if people came to see the talk because they thought it was going to be a primer on how to decapitate, they were in the wrong place.
No, not that.
It was actually sort of a post-mortem on a lot of things that were done poorly from the investigative side.
Okay.
So the victim was found in her home, and she was not discovered for several days. So by the time she was found, she had been fairly far along in decomposition.
Okay.
And it was difficult to really exactly pinpoint time of death because it was really hard to tell exactly when. So there was sort of a couple days range when the medical examiner thought she could have been killed. And from the very beginning, the defendant in the case was targeted because he was a mentally ill person in the community. It was a small rural community in South Dakota. Everyone kind of knew one another. And he had had some run-ins with the law, but nothing of a violent nature. He had put himself in voluntary treatment for his mental illness, but he had shown up to the police station on his own volition with the blood on his shirt, claiming to be the victim of a beating at a local bar. And the police dismissed him. They didn't investigate. They just sent him on his way. And later on, once the victim in this murder was discovered, one of the policemen remembered, hey, remember that guy that showed up that night and he had blood on his shirt and we sent him away? Wasn't that around the time she might have been killed? And so that's how he became a suspect.
Yeah.
And the evidence in the case was very sketchy, and specifically DNA evidence and fingerprint evidence.
Okay.
So the initial report from the crime lab stated that there was a partial fingerprint that matched the defendant on a tube of toothpaste in the victim's bathroom, and it was in her blood. That was the main item of evidence that tied him to the crime. When I was brought in to review the case files, I looked at the back of the notes, the supporting documentation, and the only thing that it said in terms of serological testing was a phenolphthalein test had been performed, which, as we all know, is a presumptive test for the presence of blood. But yet, throughout their reports, they kept referring to these stains as blood. The latent examiner's report said that there was a fingerprint comprised of blood. And so the defense had a Daubert hearing prior to trial, about 2 years prior to trial, to try to get the language truncated. We wanted to prevent them from being able to call these stains blood because they were not, in fact, ever conclusively tested to be blood. And in South Dakota, the judge that presided over that Daubert hearing decided that we didn't have enough to preclude them from using that language, and she basically said, I'm going to let them say whatever they want. You can challenge it at trial.
Okay.
So we kind of had our work cut out for us, and they also had an idea what the defense's strategy was now going to be. And so between the Daubert hearing and the trial, the Attorney General of South Dakota himself tried the case. It was becoming a high profile. It was a decapitation. That's not something you normally see out there. So there was documentation in the file that the AG went back to the lab and said, do more tests.
Yeah.
So they did another test, which was also presumptively positive. And then at trial, in addition to the reports that were emphatically stating blood, 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 the analyst kind of doubled down on her stance.
Okay.
The defense questioned her about the language, and she hid behind accreditation. She said, we're accredited, so if we're doing anything wrong, we would lose our accreditation. So what we're doing is kosher.
Yeah.
And she was asked about the phenolphthalein test and whether it was presumptive or conclusive. And this is where I say she doubled down. She said, well, the phenolphthalein is presumptive, but we can conclusively state blood because we did 4 different tests. So the defense attorney is kind of scratching her head and said, four tests, what did you do? And she said, we did a visual test. We looked at the stain. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't have that kind of scientific vision where I can look at something and tell you what it is.
I've actually seen blood stains that I didn't know were blood stains.
Right.
Because they bring them to ISHE, and I've seen them,
Right, different colors, different. So that was her first scientific test.
Okay.
She did the phenolphthalein test, which she did admit was presumptive.
Yep.
In between the Daubert hearing and the trial, they did a hemotrace test, which is another test for the presence of blood.
Yep.
She was of the opinion that hemotrace was considered a conclusive test.
Okay.
And when asked on what do you base that opinion, she said, my laboratory says.
Okay.
Basically, lab told me it's conclusive, so I'm going to come into court and say it's conclusive. The defense, through me, put on very recent, within the last 6 months, scientific peer-reviewed papers to show that hemotrace has several other body fluids that test false positive. For it's supposed to test for blood, but feces, urine, saliva can test positive.
Sure.
So we opined that it is in fact another presumptive test. And then she said the 4th test that she did was DNA. And when the defense asked her, does DNA tell you that a substance is blood? She said, not by itself, but when done in conjunction, it corroborates that the substance is blood. Which, again, when it was my turn to testify, I explained to the jury that DNA is found in all these different body fluids, and that just testing for DNA alone tells us nothing about the source, and that the tests that the prosecution had done were all still, in totality, were still presumptive, and that it was not scientifically valid to state that the substance was definitively blood. Certainly it could have been blood.
Sure.
But I believe they were overstating it. And it was important in this case because that was really the only piece of evidence tying the defendant.
There was no other DNA evidence.
There was some other DNA evidence. There was one other item, which I can discuss in a moment. But the other thing that is important to note is the victim had a documented skin condition where she had open bloody sores on her body.
Okay.
And in her home, in her bathroom, which was very dirty, I showed slides of the bathroom in my talk. It did not appear to have been cleaned in years.
Okay.
There were several tissues and bandages all over the bathroom with blood on them that were hers.
Yes.
there was this partial print on the tube of toothpaste, but in the report and even in the testimony, the state made it sound like it was like pools of blood. And I showed a photograph of the toothpaste tube.
Yeah.
It was a very, very light kind of smear, and that where you visually could see the blood was not where the latent print actually was. The latent print had to be developed on another portion of the tube that was not the visible blood.
Okay.
The defendant's story was that he did, in fact, he admitted to being in her apartment. He claims that he was at a bar with a bunch of people, and the victim asked him to walk her home because there was some other gentleman in the bar who had hassled her before, and she was worried that this other guy was gonna follow her. So he agreed to walk her home. He stated that he was inside the apartment for about 15 minutes. They listened to some music, and then he noticed the sores on her arms, and he got a little weirded out.
Yeah. Okay.
So he went to use the bathroom, and he left. Our testimony between myself and the defense latent print expert were that you would expect to find the victim's blood in her apartment. Mm-hmm. She lived there. You would also expect to find other DNA sources from her. Though he admitted to being in the home, so having a fingerprint there, because the bathroom was so cluttered and dirty, we surmised that it was possible that he could have picked up something in the bathroom that had blood on it, moved the toothpaste so that he could wash his hands, and that's how his fingerprint was left. The only other item of evidence that was of note was a sweatshirt that was seized once he was arrested. So it was his sweatshirt, found in his home. And there were a few stains on the sweatshirt, which again were presumptively positive for blood with phenolphthalein only, which they kept saying blood stains, blood stains, blood stains. And there was a stain on the outside armpit of his sweatshirt, which was a 2-person mixture, presumptively positive for blood, and they opined that it was the victim's blood.
Oh.
And that also placed him in the home.
Okay.
And again, we testified that in a 2-person mixture with a presumptive positive for blood, you can't say which person contributed the blood. Could have been his own blood and her skin cells. Could have been her blood and his skin cells from wearing the shirt. The homicide happened in the summer. There were definitely multiple eyewitness accounts that the victim had been wearing a tank top. We know she had these sores on her arm. The defendant had been wearing this sweatshirt, so again, they had been in her apartment. It's possible that either her blood from these sores or her skin could have gotten on the outside of his sweatshirt. Yeah. And so our testimony between the latent examiner and myself merely attempted to suggest to the jury that the emphatic testimony of the state was overstating and misleading, and that there were alternative explanations that fit with the data and the defendant's story, and that they should just consider those options. At the end of the day, he was acquitted on all of the charges. And what was even more frustrating was the Attorney General made a statement after the verdict and said, "We will respect the verdict of the jury," as if he had a choice, but and we're not surprised because we didn't have everything we would have liked. They never had a motive. They never had the murder weapon.
Yeah.
But the thing that shocked me the most was he said, "It's just too bad that there will never be justice for the victim." Like they were just decided, that's it. We had the right guy, the jury didn't do the right thing, we're done. So that's kind of where we are now. That was in March of this year. Yeah.
Where's the guy that beat up the guy?
So that's interesting that you say that. The cops never followed up. The defense team went to the bar to see if they could find. So the defendant claimed it was 4 guys that beat him up. They went and talked to a bartender, and the bartender said, "Oh yeah, I saw the whole thing. These 4 guys dragged him out and beat the crap out of him." So had the law enforcement followed that up, they would have known that, it was legitimate. And they did finally test the shirt that he'd been wearing, and it was all his own blood.
Yep. Wow, incredible. So I don't know about these court things. Thankfully, I've never been in one. But I'm wondering, did you guys have an opportunity to test the items that they had tested? Could you have done any other testing on those items?
We could have, but we didn't. We didn't need to. I mean, there was the only thing that we could have done, and the defense attorney questioned the state analyst when she was testifying about potential confirmatory tests for the presence of blood, because there is one, and they didn't do it. And I think the reason that I presented this case here at ISHE, and I'm also going to be talking about it at the American Academy in February, is that there are, in cases like this, if there had not been defense experts present, everything that both the latent examiner and the DNA examiner testified about sounded very authoritative, sounded very conclusive. Sure. There would be no reason for a jury to question, it's his fingerprint in her blood, open and shut case. And I think that the fact that the Attorney General tried the case when they saw that there were competent experts on the opposing side, and that we were filing Daubert hearings and challenges and requesting additional information, I don't think they're used to being challenged, and I think that, and I'm finding from talking to colleagues that's the case in a lot of places where when there is a competent expert on the other side, even if nothing was done wrong, at least the quality of the testimony is a little bit better because they're being called to task. Yeah. In the absence of that, really, you can say anything you want, and there's nobody to question it.
That is a good lesson probably for a lot of people here at ISHE who are analysts who may be going to court themselves, right? A way maybe not to answer questions or, kind of go about that way. That's very interesting. And now is this going to become a cold case that somebody else here at ISHE is going to be like?
I mean, maybe. I mean, certainly it's,
Somebody will want to find out.
There's actually, there's more to the story, but this is more of an investigative error. But about a week after the crime scene had been initially processed, it was the victim's apartment. They went back for some reason. I don't know why. And at that point, they found a cigarette butt.
What?
So either it was there initially and they missed it, which goes to their competency, or the scene had not been properly secured and someone came back. And so it was either law enforcement or someone else, right? We don't know who. So it was, at that time it was collected. The defense wanted to have it tested. Sure. Initially, the state wasn't going to test it. So they had to petition the court to have it tested. The lab tested it. They got a full profile.
Of course they did.
It was female, so not the defendant. The victim was not a smoker, and she was excluded.
Ooh.
So now we have a foreign profile in the home. Could it have been a female cop? Maybe. Yeah. We don't know. So then we requested that it be uploaded to CODIS.
Yeah.
And we fought that battle for a year. I even called in favors. I called colleagues of mine at the FBI and said, I don't understand why we can't upload this. And it was explained to me that it didn't meet the CODIS eligibility requirements, which there was not a proven nexus to the crime.
Okay.
And so, as taking off my DNA hat for a moment and putting on my lawyer hat, which sometimes I just turn them around, I was just baffled. I understood on the one hand that you don't want to overload the system with erroneous items. Yep. But here's a homicide. Here's a profile of a person. It's not the defendant, it's not the victim. Maybe it's a cop, but maybe we all know that sometimes the perpetrators come back to the scene of the crime, right? how do we know it's not related until we test it?
You could easily test it.
Well, so after about a year of filing different motions and hearings, we were allowed a one-time Estes upload just to the South Dakota state database, not to the national one. You ready?
Yep.
We got a hit.
Of course you did.
So that means that the person that hit against had already been a prior perpetrator because her DNA was in CODIS, right? The person to whom it hit was known to the victim. The victim had a restraining order out against her
You're making all this up.
for threatening to kill her. Law enforcement did not follow up.
Okay. Well, I see where this is going to go next
So,
time, Anjali.
yeah.
We're gonna. This isn't over, is it?
It's not
even,
over.
It's not even going to be a cold case. We're
No.
going to find out in
Yeah.
the very near future. Oh my gosh, what an amazing story!
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing it.
You're
with us.
welcome.
And are you going to come back to issue 36?
I hope so, yes.
That's spectacular.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So interesting stories.